Welcome to our program today. Now today we're going to be interviewing someone many of you are already familiar with. Father Paul Counce has been on Catholic Life Television many times, and as pastor of St. Joseph Cathedral, you're certainly familiar with him. But what many of you may not know is how Father Paul ended up here. And so today we want to ask him for that story and how Father Paul heard from the Lord that he was called to serve. What a blessing it is to be called by the Lord to service. Today we're joined by Father Paul Counce. Welcome, Father Paul. We ask you to share with us today a little bit, how did you end up where you are? How did you end up as pastor of the cathedral? And how did you end up called to the priesthood?
Oh my goodness. Well, I suppose the flippant side of me says, well, it was a dark day on Krypton when they sent me to Earth. But not really. My vocation to the priesthood began, as many do, not all, but many do, in a family setting. My mother was very religious. My father probably less so, coming out of World War II, but he loved her, and if she said, be religious, he listened and obeyed. I was the oldest of 10 children, and so we ended up going to church every weekend. When I became old enough to be an altar server, I frequently had to serve Mass during the week as well. Since we had a family of up to 12 people, we probably didn't recreate as other families did as much. The church was much more a center of where we went together, participating in activities at the parish. I grew up in Our Lady of Mercy Parish here in Baton Rouge. Yes, I was born in New Orleans, but they moved up to Baton Rouge as soon as they could. And so I'm a native here of our diocese. Our Lady of Mercy Parish really was the second most important nurturing point. The pastor from my about 5th grade year was Father Andrew Fry, and he always took an interest in the altar servers, in the young people. He had some very dynamic young priests as his associate pastors at that time. I remember one important one for me personally was Father Pat Mascarella, who now is retired, but was a very important figure for me because I wanted to be intelligent and hardworking and clearly available like he was. I really think that's what happens a great deal in vocations. A young man sees a priest and says, I want to be like that guy. And if he can't see himself in that role, that would be a problem. So I would like to give a little bit of a hint to other priests. Are you acting, are you speaking in a way that, that models good priesthood, an attractive priesthood that others would want to be like?
That's excellent. In addition to the priests that were there, you mentioned your family, and before we move to the priests quite yet, many of the families who might be watching today would want to wonder, what did your parents do? Were there family devotions? In what ways did your family direct you to a life of faith so that maybe some parents who are watching today might have some clues with their own children how to help them stay grounded in the faith?
The chief daily devotion was bedtime prayers. You had to kneel down by the side of your bed and say what my family now laughingly calls the good night, sweet Jesus prayer, because good night, sweet Jesus, I love you, make me a good boy or girl, depending on what you were, and keep me safe through the night. I could go on for about the next 20 minutes because it was a very formulaic devotional prayer in which we prayed for one another, we prayed for our priests, we prayed for the needy and hungry in the world, and so forth. The routine of it all, the consistency of it all was, I think, something extremely important. And then, as I mentioned a moment ago, we went to church. you really can't develop a life of deep personal faith without the church. I know that seems counterintuitive to some people to figure that something so personal as faith has to be done by myself. Mm-hmm. But in reality, since human beings need other people to become fully what their potential permits, you need a community of faith in order to develop your own faith. And on the way from church, we were always quizzed. What did Father say in the homily? What lesson did he miss? My father was famous for that. Well, I thought, sure, he was going to talk about something else. What do you think he should have talked about? Mm-hmm. And so we would correct the priest sometimes on the way home. But in a sense, mining the scriptures, mining the Bible readings for other insights that might have been a little bit more pertinent to individual members of the family or to circumstances.
Oh, certainly. I know myself, when I've spoken to young people for vocations, sometimes I've said, if any of you are sitting there thinking, I could do better than him, you certainly need to give us a call.
Oh, that's right.
So your father was already fostering in you a sense of, do you think you could do that? Could you do better than that guy? And that helps also to foster the life of faith, and could I serve the way he's serving? You talked about the community of the family, and then you talked about the community of the parish. What was it in the lives of the priests and in the lives of the parish that specifically made you feel that a life of service, a life of the church, mm-hmm. was something that may be for you?
Certainly, the priests of the parish and the sisters, the Salesian sisters who staffed Our Lady of Mercy School from about my 5th or 6th grade year. The school was not run by religious at its beginnings, but they eventually found the Salesian order to come for a while, and they staffed the school from about the time I was in about 5th grade through the time I graduated in 8th grade until sometime in the mid-1970s, I believe. In any case, they always were joyful. They were always happy people. They seemed to enjoy what they did. My father sold lumber for a living. I think he was good at it, but it wasn't an exciting profession or vocation, and it was mostly routine work that he had to do, contacts with the people he sold lumber to and that sort of thing. He always told us that if we could go into some kind of work that we would be happy in, where we could actually get paid for something we liked to do, that would be a great advantage to us. Mm-hmm. My parents stressed the need for education, as did the parish. The Our Lady of Mercy School was a primary ministry of the parish. And so we got the image of priests and sisters who were happy, intelligent, well-liked and respected in the community, eager to come up with new and different ideas. For example, my parents participated in this CFM group, the Christian Family Movement group, in the 60s and 70s. Some of those people, although many of them have passed on now, still are friends for life because the couples met together and discussed the practicalities of raising families in this world, but also how their faith helped make that better and easier. We had C.E.O, we had the Christian Youth Organization, a Catholic youth organization, I suppose, and other activities, altar servers and so forth, that made us feel a part of the parish family. You felt included, you felt wanted.
So your family made sure that the children were also a part of a ministry, that they were involved in the ministry of the church and not simply those who received from the church on Sundays.
Right. My father was actually the director of religious education for the Parish School of Religion of Our Lady of Mercy for some years. He then got involved in diocesan ministries. He was one of the co-chairs of the first lay congress we had back in the late 60s. He served on a couple of boards and the Board of Trustees of St. Joseph Seminary College for a while there in the 1970s, as I recall. It's hard for me to get the dates exactly straight because By the time I hit 1967 and got into high school, I was distracted by studies and work and girls and that sort of thing. But I did want to be a priest. I went into the seminary high school that we had here in the diocese at the time, St. Joseph Cathedral Prep School. Bishop Borders, Don Borders, was its first rector. Bishop Stanley Ott was a spiritual director in those years there, and Father John Carville eventually became the rector of the school, but also taught. So did Monsignor Bergreen, Monsignor Bob Bergreen. In high school, I got to know, pretty much on a first-name basis, at least half the diocesan priests of the diocese, the ones who were here in Baton Rouge, who stopped by the prep school constantly, either to teach, to serve as confessors or spiritual directors, or just to be friends with us all. That was a tremendous advantage. I realize the day of the high school seminary has probably gone the way of the dodo bird and is not likely to be resurrected anytime soon, but for while it lasted, it was a tremendously important way to make a young man a man of the church. The alumni of the prep school continue to meet on a regular basis for Mass and fellowship, nothing complicated, but simple friendships endure a long, long time.
So obviously in high school, they're not expecting you to make any lifelong commitments quite yet, but it does give an opportunity for a young man to learn the life of the church, the life of ministry, and begin that discernment process to whether or not he is called to that life.
Right, because at that point you begin to have daily Mass, daily prayers and devotions, the sort of a very routine life of the minister of the church becomes more and more inculcated into you.
This is a wonderful opportunity to talk about how young people can be drawn into the church. We're going to be back in just a minute or so, but when we get back, we're going to ask Father Paul a little of the obstacles that he may have faced, things that maybe were difficulties he had to overcome as he answered the call to service.
Hi, this is Deacon Jody Moscona. Join me for Catholic Life, ordinary people with extraordinary faith. These are your friends, your neighbors, members of your parish, and of course, the shakers and movers of Baton Rouge. That's Catholic Life, ordinary people with extraordinary faith.
Welcome to St. James, one of the oldest parishes in our diocese. One of the most striking features when you walk into our church, of course, is the high altar. And it is a beautiful structure, to say the least, but it also serves a function. Whenever we go to Mass, we're mindful that our worship is lifted upwards towards the Lord. And so the height of the high altar is to remind us of the heights of heaven. And the angels that are located on the pinnacles of the high altar are pretty, to say the least, but they also serve a function of reminder as well. Whenever we go to Mass, countless saints and angels are present at the celebration of the liturgy. We have images of the angels here kneeling in adoration over the tabernacle where the Mass is confected and where our blessed Lord resides. The angels are in adoration every time we go to Mass. We have a statue of them, but it's also to remind us that when we come to Mass, we should be in adoration of our Lord as well.
Do you need a little light in your life? Tune in to the next episode of Beacons of Light, where we'll share the story of the Society of St. Vincent de Paul in action, serving God's poor and homeless. We'll share stories of our volunteers and our supporters, making the gospel come to life for those in need.
welcome back to Called to Serve. We're still with Father Paul Counce, and he's sharing with us how the Lord brought him to the place where he understood that he was called to the priesthood. You had mentioned so far up to getting to the high school seminary, and that there were some distractions at that time. I think for all of us, there is some obstacles that come along in our way, things that have to be overcome before we can truly say yes and make that surrender to God and to the church. What were some of the obstacles that you faced in your journey to get to where you are now?
The biggest obstacles for me were me and my varied interests, the other things that I would like to have done. I know everybody immediately thinks of marriage because priesthood in the Western Church is a celibate priesthood. I probably, though, as a high schooler, teenager, was not so much interested in marriage as just socializing with those, not just girls. Running around with the crowd of teenagers was an attractive possibility. Having a bunch of friends, becoming more involved in athletics or in other kinds of social activities, and yet being within the smaller seminary community, the avenues and possibilities were less. It turned out, though, to be a good learning curve, because in life, every choice you make eliminates other choices. And we learned that rather gradually, and we're forced to reflect on that. We're forced to, in our spiritual direction, in our conversations with the priests who were on the staff of the prep school and that sort of thing, we were encouraged to verbalize and struggle with some of these issues and become more mature in the process. Now, by the time we graduated from high school, we were by no means adults, but we were, I think, we were people who had a better grasp of what the future could hold. That had been what had been going on in my family, that small Christian community called the CFM group that my parents were involved in. That was almost the model, a small group of people that cared about one another and encouraged, sometimes challenged one another to look at it differently, to verbalize how they felt and what they were experiencing, and thus what they wanted out of life, and for my sake, out of career or vocation, could get clarified.
Now, as you move from high school seminary to college seminary, obviously there's going to be some point where you begin to really understand that this could be your future, that you need to say yes.
And that was at college.
Okay.
I went to St. Joseph Seminary College over at St. Ben, north of Covington, and it was a wonderful time of good friendships, rigorous academics at the time. There was over 100 students in the college at that time. I know their numbers did slip for a while, although they're back up to, I think, 120 now, I heard. It was, for me, an exposure to the liturgy, the sung liturgy, not the typical parish liturgy, which was, 3 or 4 hymns and a lot of smiling. But there at the monastery, you had a much more profound experience of liturgy, the complete ritual life of the church. When we started the program today, you mentioned, how did I get to St. Joseph Cathedral? Well, you'll have to ask the bishop for the specifics on that, but I think one of the reasons is that my particular affinity and I think the kind of liturgy I'm best at is that kind of more formal liturgical worship experience. If you want to sit on the floor with the kids and gather them around and really be a father figure to them, I'll try. But I'll leave that to those who are really good youth ministers. I think I've gravitated more toward that more formal liturgy a long time ago. The St. Ben was very, very crucial for me because that's where my conviction that I really wanted to do this priesthood thing settled in.
So really for you, part of the call to service was really the call to worship, that in worship, worship needs a worship leader. and that you felt so drawn into the liturgy and the worship life of the church that you felt comfortable with the possibility that you might be one of those worship leaders.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. It was sort of like what you said a minute ago. I could do that. Sometimes I would say also I could do that better. One of the obstacles to being a servant of the Lord, of course, is overcoming one's own, what's the opposite of humility? Pride.
Yes.
and conceit. That's certainly been always a struggle for me as well. It was after college. At the end of college, I asked Bishop Sullivan, who was bishop of the diocese at the time, if I could go study in Europe. Not in Rome, in southern Europe, where many people want to, but I was very much attracted to go study in northern Europe, in Flanders and northern Belgium at the University of Louvain there. And the 4 years I spent over there, came back only twice in the whole 4 years, was another eye-opening experience. If I was exposed to a certain thing at home and a certain thing in the parish and a certain thing in the various seminaries I went to, it was in that time I was exposed to Europe and different cultures, people who didn't like the United States. These were the days of the Iranian Revolution, for example, and the first Muslim dislike of the West. And the various travels. The Soviet Union existed. It wasn't Russia. It was communist. And
That's right.
you know, being able to hop on trains and go into these places behind the Iron Curtain and experience totally different cultures, and yet also the universal aspirations of the human heart toward freedom, toward God, toward prayer, toward peace, toward family, wanting the most they could for their lives. That was very, very important. I enjoyed it.
So not just a call to the Diocese of Baton Rouge, but a call to the universal church, an understanding of the enormity of the church.
I love the
within
Diocese of
world.
Baton Rouge, but it's not. It's just one local church, and the universality of the church cannot neither be denied, ignored, nor forgotten without losing something quite crucial to the faith.
So your theology studies were done then in Belgium.
In Belgium.
And during those times, obviously, the discernment continues. Where is God calling me, and how can I best serve? And really, was there a moment when you really just owned it?
No. I know you want me to say yes, but no.
Okay.
It was much more gradual conviction, a certainty and sureness that basically I knew that this was for me. I don't begrudge those that do have those aha moments in which they fall in love, that love at first sight, or they suddenly know that this is for them. Mine was much more a developmental process. And to be honest, I think that is more common for people. This lifestyle, the kinds of things that I studied, I could master. I was never very good in math. The bookkeeper at the cathedral still laughs at me because she has to help me balance my checkbook. But maybe that's one of the reasons I went into priesthood, because I was good at literature and history and art and people. And I wasn't that good with figures. And there are engineers in this world, but I knew early on I was not going to be one of those.
Yes.
That pretty much prepared me to then come back to Baton Rouge and be a priest in Gonzales and Pierre Part at St. Pius X Church here in Baton Rouge. Bishop Ott then sent me to study canon law, so really for the past 25 years I've been the head of the tribunal, which mostly deals with marriage annulments, but also deals with other issues of church law. And I've been pastor at the cathedral since 2009.
Well, we want to really thank you for sharing your vocation story with us. If there are any young men who are watching, or those who know young men who may feel something of a call, do you have any advice for young men who are discerning their own vocation at this time?
At some point, call a priest. Doesn't have to be the vocation director, although he's very willing to talk to you. Go talk to the priest who's inspiring you. Go begin to share, do you think that this would be a good idea for me or not? what are the pros? And as you asked, what will be the obstacles? What should we work with here? It will become clear over time whether this is a decision that you will find fulfilling and lead to a happy, happy life. Seminary is also designed to reassure people that this is not your place. This is not your call. You can be a wonderful lay minister in the church, but priesthood is not the best fit for you. That's okay too.
Well, thank you for that. I just want to speak to our brothers and sisters who are watching us today by television, that we ask you to please continue to pray for those who minister in the diocese, all of you who know who are in ministry, who are serving at this time in the church, and also to please remember to pray for vocations. There are so many young men and women today that God is calling to various ways serve the church, to serve Him in ministry. But unless the prayers are supporting them, the influence of the world may be too great for them. And so we ask for your prayers for the men and women of God who are constantly in service, and also for the young people, that they might discern their call, and that they might also know what God is speaking to them, so that the church might continue to serve. Thank you, and God bless you for joining us today.